I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar today. This is a webinar that we're doing in collaboration with a number of other organisations. We're doing this with the Local Government Information Unit, an organisation which is a think tank for local authorities. And we do a number of events with them and webinars in which we try to engage not just them, but a wider audience as well. And today we've got both a local government and a wider audience. So welcome to all of you. We also are working with Ben Lee, who's going to present this webinar. And Ben is from Shared Intelligence, and he's also in the Association of Neighbourhood Managers. And he's going to talk about intentional networks. Now, we all belong to social networks in a way. And social networks are set up very often for us to make contact with each other. They're about creating relationships. But networks can be a lot more than that. They can be networks which are set up to achieve outcomes by the community, by professionals, and by other people. And those are intentional networks. They're networks with intent. And we can all create those networks to help our communities function better and to help us with our community and professional development as well. And those networks can not just be location-based, but can be global as well. We can bring in a whole series of people to help us develop a particular outcome that we want to develop. Anyhow, in this webinar, Ben is going to talk about that. So I'm going to put you over to Ben Lee now, and he will talk about what an intentional network is, the type of intentional networks there are, and how you can go about setting up an intentional network. And I hope in the discussion that we will look at some of your examples and some case studies that Ben has been involved in to see how we can develop those intentional networks to make all our work more effective. Now, while Ben is speaking, please feel free to type in the right-hand column any comments you've got or any questions in order that Ben can respond to those, or we can respond to them later when we read them through and contact you perhaps afterwards. You don't have to do too much in terms of putting links on or looking at some of the links that we're putting up and concentrating on them, because this webinar will be recorded and you will get set a link of the webinar shortly after it's over. So thank you all for attending, and I'm going to pass you over to Ben now, who is going to make a presentation, and then after that engage in a discussion with you and answer questions and address your comments. Anyhow, Ben, over to you.
So as Francis was saying, I'm going to talk about intentional networks. I've got quite a compressed presentation this morning, which is going to go through what networks are, what are intentional networks, how they differ from other kinds of networks, what kind of problems they solve, some lessons from a literature review that we recently conducted, and also some connections with another idea, which is collective impact. Thank you. I'm assuming most of the people on this call have got some kind of experience or view or knowledge of networks. So I'm just going to explain a bit about my interpretation of networks for the purposes of this morning. I'm really focusing on networks which are networks of individuals, and there's a whole another kind of subject matter around networks of organizations and institutions, but I'm going to be focusing mainly on the networks of individuals. I'm using the term network to mean any kind of set of relationships between individuals, which tends towards being informal, so not through incorporated organizations, not by virtue of working in the same place, not by virtue of having a contract. I've got a contract of employment with an organization which obliges me to turn up to work and obliges me to work with other people in a particular way in a structured organization. So networks are informal, not incorporated, not obliged through contracts, but where there is common motivation, where there's conscious membership, so members know that they are a part of it. No one's going to tap me on the shoulder and accuse me of being a network I never knew I was part of. That is not, in most circumstances, that's not the kind of network that I mean. And where the main kind of characteristic is that there's regular communication or exchange of information between members. We'll have seen lots of examples of these in our lives. People who are members of different local community groups who get together to exchange information, maybe people who run five-a-side football clubs, kind of Sunday kind of amateur five-a-side, they might meet up. People who maybe run volunteering groups might meet up to compare notes or for kind of mutual support. You have probably come across business networks of business owners and managers and entrepreneurs. Kind of local business networking is something which is very, very commonplace. I'm reading off the bullets at the bottom of this slide. People with similar functional roles may form networks with others. That could be anything from childminders in a local area, childminders that have got a motivation to meet up with other childminders because they want to exchange information about local activities to take their young charges to. Plus, when they meet up, they might get 20 or 30 minutes respite. People with advanced skills, surgeons in a very specialist field might network with one another on very large geographic scales, again, to exchange professional ideas. People with a shared interest or pursuit who haven't joined a club or association might form a more informal network relationship. So somebody who doesn't want to become an active member of the Northumberland Wood Turning Society might still go to events which are more informal. People with similar political beliefs who, besides being part of a formal political party, may network, or there may be people with similar political beliefs for whom networking is a prior move to forming a political party. And people might use networks to seek trading or commercial relationships. People who like a Facebook page for South London car boot sales do that because they're seeking commercial or trading relationships. They're not doing it because they believe in the transformative power of car boot sales. They're doing it because they're just seeking an opportunity for to get rid of the rubbish in their garage, make some money, and have an enjoyable day out. eBay, Etsy, online communities are also about seeking commercial relationships for many people. Just going to move on to the next slide. Hopefully we're still looking good in terms of technology. So what's an intentional network? All those things I just mentioned are networks. An intentional network, and this is not my term, this is a term that I've found useful, which has come from the literature. An intentional network, a network's where the intent or the motivation or the benefit tends to be more towards a group motivation and benefit than an individual. So take the car boot fair example. Someone who turns up because they simply want to get rid of the rubbish in their garage and make a few quid. That's an individual motivation. Someone who actually believes passionately in a transformative power of boot fairs and their role in kind of a reuse, low carbon society and economy, and organises boot fairs and goes to every single one, that's more about buying into an intent of group action. So intentional networks are where the motivations are group more than individual. Many people have written on this subject, and this is quite a compressed presentation, so there are lots of different threads to follow up afterwards. One definition which I found useful, and clearly others have because it's often quoted, is that networks have been established in the public and non-profit sectors to create collective solutions to complex problems through cross-boundary actions, where those boundaries might be jurisdictional, organisational, programmatic, geographic, professional and sectoral. That's from a piece of work by the IBM in America, the IBM Centre for Business of Government, from 2 years ago. Now, in my view, that is describing intentional networks. That is not people taking part in something for an individual benefit. This is where there's some collective or group or larger strategic purpose behind the network. Intentional networks can be local or could be international or anything in between. They can be large in number, hundreds of people, I would say it's large, or small, only a dozen. In all cases that we've seen, digital technology is transformational in how intentional networks operate. But anyone with historical interest would instantly say, yeah, but things like the transatlantic networks in the 1700s were intentional networks. This is nothing new. So technology is transformational, but it doesn't mean that intentional networks are new. So traders, the Carolina traders and their peers in the UK were a very effective network in the 1700s, and then political networks for and against the abolition of slavery, which came after it, were very effective networks, and they didn't meet face to face. They used technology to communicate, and the technology was pen and ink. And of course, most of what we're talking about today is networks with good or at least benign intentions, but networks can be used for good or bad or very destructive ends. I'm going to give a couple of examples of networks that I've worked with over the past couple of years to flesh out and give some examples of what intentional networks actually look like. One network that I've been working with recently is a network of public library innovators in the UK. It was formed almost a year ago, not quite. It was formed at the instigation of a group of senior council officers from around the country who manage public libraries. It's not for them, it's for people who work for them, but they instigated it. And secured funding to enable it to happen. It's grown from 30. I and a colleague have grown it from 30 to 130 people over the course of about 10 months. It has a very clear purpose, which is to share ideas which enable public libraries to increase their impact. It is facilitated quite heavily, and my colleague and I have focused on both the digital and the human technology. And I'll say a bit more about that later. But essentially, we've looked at what technical solutions we can have so that people can communicate. We use Basecamp, but also what human technology we need to ensure that people understand what they're part of and are able to contribute. So we spend a lot of time, for instance, inducting people into the network and explaining how it works and encouraging them to make their first contributions. We get about contribution every day, about 16 a month. It's kind of ticked up in the last couple of weeks. I don't know why, but that's great. We've only had one physical meeting, and we've got another one planned. So mainly this is an online network, and it's already begun to connect with other networks, for instance, networks in Australia. Another example is something called a patient carer community. And I think my colleague Sophie is in this list of participants here, or she was a minute ago, unless she's fallen off. Sophie Edwards and I supported a group of people who were patients and carers who take part in simulations for trainee doctors. This is quite a common thing. Trainee doctors have lots of simulations. Often it's actors or volunteers, but not people. So someone walks into a room and the simulation's about someone who's got dementia or someone who's recovering from cancer, but the person there is acting. They don't really have dementia. They don't really have cancer. This is a group of people, of patients who really do have these conditions and agree to take part in simulations for trainee doctors. So everything about it is real, except the consultation is a training exercise and not a real consultation. They identified themselves by what they are not, and they actually very much were clear that they are not a network, because for them, network has connotations of professional setting and of being very transactional. That was just their interpretation of the word network. So they see themselves as a group who put real stories at the heart of medical school curriculum so that patients, carers and their families can experience the best possible healthcare. And this is because, to start with, many of them took part in this because it was a way of just giving back a little to the hospital. But essentially it was, we'll give some time, we'll take part in a simulation. What they began to realise was that by having actual patients with real life experiences take part in these simulations, it was changing the culture and the dynamic in those training sessions, which in turn was changing the culture of newly qualified doctors. So they began to see what potential they had for impact on a wider scale, and they wanted to capture that through their community, not a network. And finally, the National Neighbourhood Management, National Association for Neighbourhood Management, which I set up with 6 other people 10 years ago. Now, on the one hand, this is a bit more of a complicated example. I think it's a good one because the National Association for Neighbourhood Management is a company limited by guarantee, so it is an incorporated body. It's set up by me and one other kind of paid staff, and also 6 trustees. So we're not a network, as in the 8 of us. We have a mailing list of 7, it's actually a bit more than that, 700 or 800 people who we communicate with. Again, people who just receive information. A mailing list is not a network. But what we're able to do is hold 2 face-to-face events a year, which usually generate turnouts of about 70 people. And at those, we can see that actually everybody there, and it's a different 70 people every time, it's kind of depends on the subject matter, but from those 700, what we see is that people are all committed to a broader goal rather than just exchanging information and getting things which help them in their everyday life. But they actually want to promote this approach of neighbourhood management, which is about enabling people to influence public services. And the content of those gatherings is created by network members. So there's a willingness to kind of actively contribute as well. So we've got a group of 8 people who are not a network, a mailing list, which is not a network, but these gatherings of people from those 700 people, which is an intentional network by this definition. Just going on to what problems do networks solve? Well, this is kind of thinking back to the IBM quote at the beginning from that piece of research. For public and government authorities, single organisational, we see this every time, all day, every day now in the news, single organisational responses are increasingly struggling on big, wicked social issues, whether it's public health, poverty reduction, public safety, a whole host of other things. For civic society groups, of which France's network is a great example, have always seen intentional networks as important, but often alongside more formal groups such as political parties, membership organisations, faith groups, churches. But what we've seen is that many of those more formal organisations are, at this point in time, often in flux or losing influence or losing membership, or that people are joining less because they believe in the goals and aims and mission of that formal organisation and more just for transactional reasons. A great example is the National Trust. So the National Trust is the largest membership organisation in the country, and the National Trust will say, "Oh, this is brilliant. It shows that people support our values and want to show how many people care about our kind of built and historic environment." Actually, a lot of people join the National Trust because it's free parking and discounted entry fees to a kind of a useful fun day out. It's purely transactional. It means nothing about whether they care about the aims and objectives of the National Trust in a broader sense. So formal organisations becoming more transactional, possibly losing influence, networks becoming more important. And for individuals, intentional networks can meet some immediate, tangible need for knowledge and information, but also a sense of membership and belonging, especially when seen alongside how much traditional organisations are providing that for people. So, in a nutshell, the problems they're trying to solve are silos in different ways. Silos in our own belonging and identity, silos in big bureaucracies, silos in the way that people align with formal organisations. I'm just going to talk a bit now about the literature review that we carried out. This is for a national government agency that was starting a program, very, very familiar kind of thing, a national government program which kind of runs in 20 or 30 different parts of the country. In each part of the country, there's a small project team, maybe people in paid positions, maybe people in voluntary positions, some money. And this government agency wanted to connect up those different people from those different localities so that it can be more than the sum of the parts. This is a kind of a very common thing in central government, very common thing amongst national charities, even amongst commercial organisations. And as part of this, we were commissioned to conduct a literature review of peer learning networks, but we were particularly interested in intentional networks as a subset of that. And this is what we found in the literature. It was interesting that intentional networks were often linked to the development of an inquiry mindset, meaning that when people came together because of some clear kind of group purpose, they became more interested in why things were working, so things related to the aims of a network, why things were working. And then linked to this, there was an increased appetite for evidence. So in some ways, it created an environment which was pro-data, pro-facts and pro-evidence. We didn't look at whether it was pro-facts and evidence, which served to reinforce their worldview or challenged it, but certainly pro-facts and pro-evidence. It was most powerful when there was some form of exchange of situated learning, i.e. learning which is immediately relevant, very practical and tangible, which you can go off and use instantly, in addition to theoretical understanding. We found in the evidence review that membership could be diverse up to a point. Too broad a membership will lose that sense of social connection. this is kind of generalizing across the research, so obviously there were exceptions to all of these, that networks can be remote and online, but face-to-face contact is important, although there is some indication that some claims that there's a generational shift, that we may be entering an era where people are more comfortable forming social bonds with people that they don't get to meet. And that, again, is not new, because if we look back to kind of pre-mass transport and fast transport, we'd see networks where people communicated by writing and by letter, and maybe seldom or never. It's important for members to learn how the network works, the norms and conventions, and often references to Etienne Wenger's work on legitimate peripheral participation, which is more than just saying it's okay to be a lurker. This is about saying that networks where a function of networks is to enable people to find out how it works. That's why in our libraries network we spend a lot of effort in inducting people and encouraging them to find out how the actual social dynamics of that network work. There are challenges clearly around some people, network members, find it challenging when they join a network that it only really works for them if they are able to discuss their vulnerabilities and what's not working well, whereas maybe their first reaction is to present everything as fine and present their strengths. Success factors. I guess you might think that we would say this because this is the thing that I'm passionate about, the thing that we do for a living. Success factors are good organisation and facilitation, and of course the resources to make those happen. So it doesn't just come about through, networks can't run just on the oxygen of enthusiasm. They do take a role, a defined role. Moving on now. So I'm just going to present two final ideas. One is about making networks visible. Now, when I was first involved in the work around networking and neighbourhood management, it was part of the government's neighbourhood renewal programme, and there was interest at that point, it's about almost 10, 15 years ago, in trying to explore and visualise, make visible the connections, social connections in a neighbourhood. And there was an excellent piece of work done at that time called the Connected Communities Project. It was done by the RSA, Royal Society of Arts and Advancement of Science, and whatever it is. Anyway, the RSA. And at that time, the RSA were conducting a great piece of research, which is still available online, Connected Communities, which looked at social connections in an area of New Cross. And this was looking at where does the social capital lie. At about the same time, I also had the opportunity to work with two very interesting people, Drew Mackey and David Wilcox, who might also be on this call, you never know. They are also members of the Francis Network, who were looking at not located in a neighbourhood, but networks, social network analysis of people connected either by an organisation or by a shared interest. And a lot of that was about what you could learn as a network leader, which would enable you to guide and steer that network and develop it. And I became very interested in that. But even more interested, not in what you can learn as a network leader, but what the effect is and impact of showing people their networks. And so here's an example from, this is also another thing that I've worked on with Sophie. If Sophie's still managing to hang on the call, I think she still is there somewhere. And this is a map of connections gathered by asking people who you know, a map of connections between people who are part of ageing and social care network on the South Coast. It's kind of grouped. The colour coding shows what sector they're in. Red for academic, blue I think for medical, green for voluntary sector, purple for local authority. There are names of organisations, but actually they could just as well be names of individuals. But we took the what organisation do you work for column rather than the first name column. It just felt more appropriate. But these are really connections between individuals. And the effect of showing people this does, and I've used this on a number of occasions, it actually changes people's behaviour because people instantly want to know, where am I? Am I the one who's connecting? Am I not? So it's a bit like the kind of behaviours we see with in kind of social networking, online digital social networking and social media. And people want to know, but then it's the feedback between people being aware of where they sit, then influencing their actions. It's very, very interesting indeed, and a very different take on the social network analysis, not about what network leaders can do, but what the effect it has on participants to visualize where they stand. And my final slide is just this connection with this, what I think is a very interesting related idea of collective outcomes. So this is something which has emerged in the United States, sometimes called collective impact, sometimes collective outcomes. It's about using data to frame debates, about using very specific numerical goals to encourage many organizations to work in concert. It's been really emerged in the US around education and education charities and NGOs, of which arguably there's probably more, and they're fighting on a dwindling funding pot. And it helps overcome the issue where people sometimes, especially in community organizations, worry about if we align what we do or measure the same thing, then are we kind of writing our own extinction? We've tried to implement this in the UK with a youth empowerment organization based in Leicester called the Mighty Creatives. Really, really very excellent organization. And they are a conduit for government funding to then a whole host of other regionally and locally based organizations. And what they wanted to do was try and get those organizations working more closely together. So obviously it comes across kind of not often kind of overt, but some subtle issues around rivalries and competition and people wanting to work together, but not wanting to kind of write their own extinction, as it were. So what they did was they set a goal at the start of this whole set of projects, and every project was going to be different. It was going to be with different people, different schools, different areas. But they set a single goal, which is to reach children and young people and to get them involved in cultural and arts activity and to target children and young people from the most deprived areas. So far, so simple. What they realised when they gathered their data at the end, by gathering exactly the same data, how many children from deprived areas took part in arts activities because of our projects, they realised that even though their projects were very different, they had all managed to target the children and young people they wanted. So that wasn't an outcome of using the Collective Outcomes Project. The Collective Outcomes Project showed that was because they were brilliant arts projects. The Collective Outcomes Project showed them that whereas previously they might have had 25 different ways of explaining in sort of similar but not identical ways their impact, they were able to come up with a big figure that we have reached several hundred children through these dozens of projects, and 4 out of 5 of those children came from the most culturally disengaged and most economically deprived areas. And when they saw the power of that single message, they then wanted to know, right, what else can we do next? How can we get more organizations gathering the same data? Not necessarily doing the same thing, but gathering the same data. So that, Francis, is where I'm going to end it. So I'm just going to say thanks for your time, and hopefully I've caught up a little time, and now we can take some questions.
Great. I mean, John Woodhouse was saying that he's worried about setting up any networks of any kind, and especially when you're trying to get data and you're talking about personal things about people you're working with.
So I think there's 2 answers to this. I think the thing about the thing that I'm often most nervous about is gathering data from the thing about people's kind of interpersonal connections in a room, and we do that. We either do it by organisation, or I usually do it by first names, and also it's quite clear what we're about to do, so people kind of have to opt into that. And we never kind of share the data which lies behind it, so not in an open way. The thing about sharing the collective outcomes stuff. What we were sharing there was postcodes, so it's not personally identifiable data. There was no first name, no last name, not even the kind of age or any kind of attributes or characteristics of the person. It was just postcodes. 500 participants, 500 postcodes, and we found that postcodes are probably one of the most kind of powerful bits of data you can gather because it tells you so much, but without having the kind of problems that, around personal data. And the other really interesting thing is that when we were gathering postcode data on children who had participated in arts projects, a lot of the arts organisations were absolutely not terrified, but anyway, they're incredibly sceptical about us saying go and ask schools for the postcode data of children who'd taken part in your projects. And when they asked the schools, they were worried that they had been worried that it would damage their reputation with schools. They were over asking. The schools just said, "Oh, do you want it in rows or columns?" Schools were incredibly used to handing over postcode data, And that was a revelation to many of the arts organisations we work with. And I suspect many other organisations are also very used to handing over postcode data. And I think there's a world of difference between asking for that kind of data, which tells you something about someone, but without being able to identify them.
Someone asked you about the impact stories. You were talking about the collective impact stories. I mean, what did it take to bring that about? Because stories can be incredibly effective in any network.
Okay, so we're only just starting this, and definitely go to the Mighty Creatives website. The Mighty Creatives, it's on that slide. .co.uk, I think they are. .com, themightycreatives.com, and we've only just really started because we're only working with a small number of organisations. Because, as I said, a lot of the people didn't want to take part in this; they felt it was a thin end of a wedge or a beginning of a slippery slope. So what we've actually done is just collect kind of fairly simple data from 12 organisations, and then we've used something called Pictochart to create some very, very simple graphics of collective impact. So we've shown the thing about how 4 out of 5 children across multiple projects all came from the most deprived parts of the East Midlands. So at the moment, the main effort has been getting people together, winning their trust, and then getting them to gather data accurately. The sorts of things that have been done in America is pretty much the same thing. It's just more effort has been put into winning the trust of more organisations and gathering data on a larger scale. And as you gather it on a larger scale, it takes more time to interpret it. So it's a simple process that can be done quite easily when it's on a small scale, and it's just a scale up to cover more organisations.
Pam was saying, when you talk about postcodes, by the way, do you mean the full postcode? Because that would identify you pretty easily.
We do mean a full postcode, and it wouldn't. If you, in most parts of the country, a full postcode doesn't identify an individual.
I mean, so intentional networks, they can be community networks. Yeah, they can be professional networks. They can be social networks that want to achieve an action. Intentional network, I mean, you've been talking a lot about professional networks and people getting together, but an activist in a community could also set up an intentional network, couldn't they?
Say that. Who could set up an intentional network?
Activists in a community, if they want to achieve something.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, but the difference, I guess, there's no. I'm not saying people should set up intentional networks. It's good to set up intentional networks. It's bad to set up things which are different. It's just about being aware of the choices that you can make about what you're trying to create. And I think just being aware of the difference between a network where people take part in it because mainly for individual motivations versus something which has a kind of group intent is a choice that that anybody can take. And I think in a lot of community groups probably are intentional networks. They're often set up in response to a problem. Someone's going to close a school. There have been too many accidents on a stretch of road. People are worried about air quality, things like that. So there's often a goal. I guess the challenge sometimes is if that short-term goal fades, the battle's lost, the battle's won, then what's the longer-term shared goal that's going to continue keeping people together so that it doesn't, or does it just become a network that, right, we did that thing and now we just get together because we each get a little bit of social benefit out of it? I think it's about just thinking of it in these terms can help more conscious decisions be made about what is it I'm trying to do.
Okay, I mean, also, you're talking about activist network, that's fine. But for local government, I mean, you often have people in local government, especially at ground level, who are very, very enthusiastic and keen. They want to be change agents, but they're finding it difficult in their local authority. How useful is intentional networks how useful are they if someone in that situation of isolation, tries to set up a network with like-minded people in other local authorities to help, them avoid the isolation and handle change better? Have you come across those sort of networks as well?
Yes, I guess that's why we set up this the National Association for Neighbourhood Management, which isn't a network, it's a bit of network infrastructure that enables a network to exist. That's why we set that up. I think there's lots of things where there are lots of kinds of roles in government where you're the only person with that role in your organisation. So your main sense of connection is not with other people in your organisation, but other people doing similar roles 20, 30 miles away. And so it is possible for one person to set something up, but I guess the main challenge is always going to be resources. So does that person have the resources either as part of their current job description that they can spend however long it takes to set that kind of thing up? Do they have the energy, or are they just in a position where they have the freedom to do that, maybe not even formally on their work time, but doing it outside of their work time is something they do voluntarily? Or is there some kind of resource provided to them by their organisation to help them do that, to give them the time, or give them the money to get someone who does have the time? So I think it can be incredibly powerful, especially when people are in roles where they don't have peers locally, and their peers are actually distributed in 150 other local authorities. But the question is resource, and I think this is some of the work that we've been doing with neighbourhood management and community engagement. Shows actually there isn't the resource, and it's a struggle to find that. Whereas I think in healthcare, there are people within the NHS family, locally and nationally, who do, or maybe beginning to recognise that this is a kind of structural, strategic issue that deserves resources and will benefit from having resources put into it, rather than something which kind of one or two people say they benefit from, but they're not quite sure what the strategic benefit for the bigger organisation is, therefore they don't fund it.
Okay. People are asking links to your organisations. Maybe they didn't get it the first time. Okay. So as you're answering the next question, I'll put the links up again to Ben's organisations. And as I said, you don't have to sort of go to them now. You'll get that in the recording, so don't worry. Sophie, who you know, Ben, is talking about the IP knowledge products created by online intentional networks, and I think she wanted you to say something about that. And secondly, she was saying, how do you actually create a collaborative framework in intentional networks when you're trying first to build the networks up and create an identity for the network itself? How do you achieve that?
I think Sophie is handily rehearsing a discussions that we've had, which are really, really difficult. So hopefully they make for an interesting webinar, but I'm not sure I've got the answers. But I think if you're creating something collaboratively with a large group of people who have only got informal relationships between one another and not formal, they don't all work for an organisation, they're not all members of the Scouts or something like that, you know. Then people are actually having to figure out what their relationship is and what the give and take is as they're in that. So in terms of, well, I've got a great idea, do I share it here? Knowing that I can't control who then shares it on, or do I sell it into this community, whether sell it for cash or sell it for some kind of benefit in kind? I think people need to, I mean, as in many kind of fields of life, when you're outside formal kind of structures that give you the safety of, I know what my relationship is to him, I have to sit down and work with him every day, don't really like him, but I do. You know, when you don't have that safety net of being told what your relationship is, you've got to figure it out. So I think probably that discourages people from developing things in those networks because they're not quite sure, or that maybe they give up a lot of what they would then in hindsight consider their IP and maybe aren't so sure whether they introduced it to the world in the right way. So I think it needs figuring out. I think the stuff about collective outcomes in the US, I think that hasn't really bottomed out that issue, because in a way it's about people showing their collective impact, but the backdrop is a dwindling funding pot. So I think some people probably do feel that, well, we've made a point about the work that we do and the impact it has, say, on early years education, but we've also shown that there are 60 organisations all doing very, very similar things, and that's going to raise questions about funding. So I don't think there has been a way of answering this. I think for me, the main thing is when you go into a set of relationships without the safety of some rules, then you have to figure those relationships out individually. What is on what basis am I willing to take part in this? And I think as long as people understand that they need to have those conversations, that's probably the starting point. I think once you then try and capture it in a set of rules, and it's no longer a network, it's then an organization.
Okay. We'll probably go on a bit longer than 12 o'clock because we were about 10 minutes late starting because of the slight technical problems. So we'll get our full hour, so don't worry. Mary is worried about the sort of software you use and what you use. I mean, she's talking about some people have used Nation Builder, which is US based, and Nation Builder is used a lot by politicians, I know, in America, and some people in Westminster use it as well. And people are worried about, in the age of big data, that data is collected by the wrong sort of organizations. If someone came to you, Ben, and said, look, I want to set up an intentional network for an organization I belong to and other organizations, how would you recommend they start, and what software would you say use? Do you think through that, or is that something you leave to them because there's so many different types of software? Have you got any specific advice? I'm not massively expert on which software to use. I'm just like a magpie. I use the things that I've seen that work. Personally, I think for my own data, I think the ship sailed long ago if I was ever worried about sharing it. So even if I stop using things, I think there's so much of my data out there already. So it's just too bad. I should have figured that out in about 1998. I think we use Basecamp for our libraries network, which I think works really well. It's not really designed for setting up intentional networks. It's more for workplace projects, but there's just something about the fact that it's really easy to make sure that people keep getting the messages the default is that you're opted into messages and it keeps the communication going. The downside of it is that anybody who's part of the network can switch things on and off and reset your settings. So it's a huge amount of trust that no one's going to either deliberately press the wrong button and wipe out half of your stuff or intentionally do it. I think in some of the work that we've done or that I've been involved in with community groups in a lottery-funded initiative called Big Local, these are groups which have been set up because they've received some lottery money. So in a way, they're organised, but there is networking between people involved. So between activists who have taken on active roles in Big Local in Ipswich and their peers in Collyhurst and Bristol and Reading and deepest, darkest Lincolnshire. There's lots of networks which get set up, and a lot of them use Facebook because they're on Facebook. So these are people who they're busy, they're volunteers, they're not massively tech savvy, they don't want to try and learn how to use something else. They can't afford any premium subscriptions, and they use Facebook actually. Do they know what the risks are if Facebook changes their rules, or where Facebook stores their information, or what happens if they invest lots of time and then Facebook suddenly says in a year's time you've got to pay for this stuff, or we're not doing it anymore? I don't know, but they do use it because for the time being it's very, very easy. So there's kind of ease and magpie, so I can't give anything authoritative on how to make that choice. I mean,
David Wilcox can, though, if anybody knows him.
Yeah, I mean, David Wilcox, and I do too, to some extent now, use a piece of software called Slack that you can do on your mobile phone, and it's a way of actually having a project team working together. So I don't know if any of you know Slack, but it's worth looking up Slack if you haven't. It's a good way to create project teams. It's a text system, but it is a good way of working. So Ben, what would your advice be again? Someone comes along and says, I want to set up an intentional network, either for professional development or for community activism. What's your step-by-step guide for setting up that network? What would your advice be?
I'd say sit down, have a cup of tea or coffee, and tell me what you hope to achieve by it.
And then
I wait for them to answer. Do they just everyone's setting up intentional networks? I thought it'd be a good idea. The network that is just the way to achieve something. So I think the most important thing is to be really, really clear on what is it. What's the problem in the world you're trying to solve? Are you trying to solve the fact that your your role is in a council and you're meant to be tackling childhood obesity, but you've got no resources, no one else in your local authority who can help you, you've got no peers, but you know that there are people out there and you want to connect with them because you've got no other resources at your disposal anymore. Is your problem that you're a community activist and you're trying to get your head around neighbourhood planning, but it's just too technical, but you know that there are other people who have already tried to solve this problem, so you're trying to shortcut having to get yourself a quick master's in neighbourhood planning and trying to connect with other people so that you can join forces because you've got little time and you're doing this as a volunteer 2 hours on a Friday night. So my first question is, what's the problem you're trying to solve? And the second is, and why do you think it can be solved through a network? And is it because, as I said, is it because you think that there are other people who aren't in your immediate vicinity and you don't have formal connections with who could help with? Is it because you think that people don't quite know it yet, but would be really, really motivated by the ideas that you've got if you only had a chance to connect with them? Is it because someone's actually telling you you have to kind of go down this route and you just need to turn it into some practical action? Someone's saying, oh, we should be joining up with all these other people. What do we do about it? So I would say, and if you get that far, then probably the first thing I would say is get the other people who you think might be in that network, get them together in a room first and see if there's the connection you think exists. And then if you got them together in a room, which is difficult, or at least some of them, and they think that there's a connection, they think there's something to be done, they agree with the shared possible group goal that you've posited, they go, yeah, I share that goal. Then maybe you can use Basecamp or Facebook or call David Wilcox or Francis and say, what can we use to get these people together and talking?
Okay, so you've got
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. But you got that far. But there's there's 4 elements. I think you mentioned.
There's another 10.
Yeah, there's probably 10. But one other element is, I want to start something in neighbourhood development, as you said, and there must be people out there who are interested in it. So next step is, how do you find those other people? You're setting up a social network really to reach other people, to reach the parts that normal systems don't reach, and you're trying to find them. So what steps can you take to go and find the people you want to find out there, to develop an intentional network that you want to develop?
That's really difficult because it kind of paints a picture of someone who wants to set up a network but isn't actually that well connected, and I think that misses the bit about the role of the network leader or network instigator. Almost all the things that I've mentioned today, whether they're things that I've been involved in myself or things that came across in research, all the kind of the networks that appear to be doing something had someone at the heart of it who was already connected. So not someone who just kind of says, look, I'm new to this, I want to do something, I don't know anybody, I'm not that well connected, but I want to try and create a network. That would be really, really quite unusual. It'd be more likely that someone who was connected, maybe who had some kind of social resources to bring to it, set something up. And what they're really trying to do is just focus those connections and maybe draw in more. So the libraries thing, what we did was we gathered people who were already talking to one another, and we were already talking to a lot of them, but it hadn't been formalised. It's very ad hoc and very fleeting. We tried to formalise it and build it and keep it and sustain it. The patient carers were already knew each other. It wasn't one person thinking, I want to start a patient carer community. They already knew each other, but they didn't articulate and organise themselves in a way that got the most out of a network relationship. So I think it'd be quite rare for someone to find themselves relatively unconnected and wanting to start a network. And I think if they did, that would be quite difficult.
So if you're an individual and you've just got a good idea, it isn't enough. You've got to think of the connections before you start.
Well, but most individuals who have those good ideas do have connections. That's why there's people with ideas. So if I think of my neighbour, Teresa, I won't give you her postcode because then you know a postcode and first name, you have personal data on it. But my neighbour, Teresa, runs a very, very small scale lift sharing thing. She doesn't actually drive herself, she rides a bike, but she coordinates lifts with volunteer drivers for elderly people in our community. She might want to try and connect with other people organising other similar things, because she's got, like, I don't know, a couple of dozen people who drive cars and they can transport maybe a roster of maybe 30 people. But if she connects with someone about 2 miles away, 3 miles away, 4 miles away, they could have something much bigger. But she's already connected. So it would, that's the kind of person who would probably start something. They'll probably be already connected. What they're trying to do is broaden their connections. And then you go back to the question about, why do you want to do that? Why do you want to do that? I honestly think it would be very unusual for someone to be like a complete newbie savant, but have an idea, not have yet tested it with other people or got to know other people, and want to dive straight in. And I think if anybody ever did come up to me in the street and say that, they probably need to just maybe look at who they already know. But I think starting from scratch, or perceiving yourself as starting from scratch, would be a very, very difficult thing to do.
Some people also think that, you know, networks are sort of anarchic, amorphous sort of things that grow by magic. I always say networks are 2 syllables, net and work. You create the net, but you've got to work it afterwards. If you don't work it, it's no good. You can't sort of set it up and then sit back and, you know, wait for it to happen. How important is it for there to be a connector, a sort of lead person? Goes against some people's sort of ideology to have a lead person, but you do need a connector. You need someone who makes a connection, does the work, and gets people together. I mean, is that something you've given a lot of thought to?
I mean, or sometimes it's the other way around. So often someone said, "Oh, there's this really brilliant network. They're doing all this amazing stuff, and it's fantastic because there's all these different organisations, and yet they've overcome their kind of boundaries and different, kind of goals and stakeholder groups, and they're really effective, and they've done some amazing things." And then you dig in, and what do you find? You find there's somebody at the middle of it, almost every single time. Sometimes 2 people, sometimes 3, not often more than 3. But you dig in, and when you see something which on the outside looks like this kind of amazingly kind of like laser guided, highly effective shoal of anchovies or people, you dig in and you find there's actually a couple of people or one person at the heart of it who just had an idea and is completely driven, or maybe a couple of people, a group of friends. It'd be really unusual not to find someone at the heart of it. It may have splintered off, and you may actually look like one big network, but it's actually 3 or 4 communities together. Maybe that's what things like Anonymous are. But even something like Anonymous, which I've never really delved into, I would suspect there is a hardcore of activists who've maybe splintered out, but it's not just a frenzy of anarchic energy.
So, if you're developing these networks, I mean, do you think that we're getting close to the end now? I mean, the great value of networks of this kind is it not, that in the digital age, you can go beyond your local environment. You can cross all sorts of boundaries that you couldn't cross before, or you had to cross with great difficulty. And that's the really exciting thing about it. But because it's exciting, sometimes people get carried away from it, and they don't understand, or they don't give enough thought to the nitty-gritty things that you've talked about. So is it important to say, right, get excited about it. You can cross those boundaries in a way you could never did before, but you still have to think it through step by step.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of energy has been put in over the last 10 years to this now quite sophisticated and complex online networking platform run by the local government association called Knowledge Hub. And oh God, I mean, there's probably someone on here who's been connected with it. But it's brilliant in that it's very, very sophisticated, it's well trusted, and it works really quite slickly. But there's most of the threads on there. The last post, the last message was like October 2015, or you're looking actually, oh no, it's actually October 2014. The technology is there, but there's no network relationships, and they're trying to. They've now got the technology is very, very elaborate, but now they're trying to kind of backfill it with the relationships, and I don't know, maybe it will prove me wrong, but it looks like it's struggling. People maintained network relationships, and I used to work with a colleague here who wrote his doctoral thesis on the trading relationships between the Carolinian colonial business men, mainly men, and their counterparts in the UK. His name's Hugh David, and I would commend his PhD thesis about colonial networks in the 1700s between Britain and the Carolines. And those people barely ever met. And when they sent a letter, it took 6 weeks to arrive, if it ever arrived. And yet they maintain very effective networks without face-to-face. So the idea of digital networks isn't new. The idea you can create relationships without face-to-face is not new. I think we're going from a period having had sort of the kind of explosion of fast travel, where people have been used to face-to-face, and maybe it's coming back around a little. So I can't remember what the question was, but those are my two responses to it. It's not new. The idea of remote networking is not new, but you can create elaborate things. If you haven't got relationships, then they're just elaborate but empty.
Okay, you may have forgot the question, but you did answer it. So that's okay. Okay, I mean, come to the end of it. We've gone on for another 10 minutes, so we've got the first hour of this. So I just want to say thank you, Ben, for doing that. And I'm sure we'll do more again in the future, because I think that's really interesting. And I think a lot of people will learn a great deal and will seek your advice about that. Okay, that's the Twitter
if you miss my contact details, follow me on Twitter and you'll find a link to everything else there.
Okay, no one's ever done that before, stuck a sign up. They usually tell me, I like that. Those are my notes. So there we go. Okay, well, thanks, Ben. That's great.